I haven't seen the movie in many years.
Do we need the mic here?
Do you want that?
Yeah.
Are these live?
Yeah.
I don't know, probably about 15 years since I've seen the movie. And I guess I should start by saying that I wrote the screenplay. But, you know, I think film is a director's medium. And I think in the end, I was not entirely pleased with the result, although I thought there were a lot of good things about it. But,
you'll have to hold the mic.
Okay. But I had, you know, I had somewhat mixed feelings about the movie, and you know, I do to this day. Although I have to say, I was very, I don't know, it was. I thought those 4 scenes were pretty powerful, and they brought me back.
Did they hang on to your adaptation pretty much? I mean, did you have much creative input in the film?
I had a lot of input in the sense that my screenplay was shot almost verbatim. It's kind of a funny progression, although not so unusual in Hollywood. I wrote the. I was originally commissioned to write the screenplay. Sidney Pollack was the. No, I'm sorry. It started out with a producer called Jerry Weintraub, and I'm sure you probably don't know who Jerry is. He just wrote a very successful book, and he's done a lot of great movies. But so initially we had Jerry Weintraub, who was a producer, and he signed Joel Schumacher as the director. Schumacher was very hot at that time because he'd just come off of a movie called St. Elmo's Fire, which had all those. Which sort of created this group of young actors, which would quickly be labeled the Brat Pack, and Joel was sort of considered the guy who understood the kids in their 20s then, and so I wrote 3 successive drafts of a screenplay. They flew me out to Hollywood. Actually, I was working in a liquor store at the time while I was going to graduate school. And I got a phone call at the liquor store from my girlfriend saying, "You're about to get a call from somebody who claims to be from Paramount Studios." And it was this guy named Michael Bessman, who's an important person in the film business. And he told me that they had just read my manuscript and they were going to fly me out to Hollywood and make a big movie. And he asked if I could be there next week, and I said I didn't know if I could afford the ticket. And he said no, you idiot, we'll fly you first class, of course. And then he asked me where I wanted to stay, and I said I had no knowledge of Hollywood or LA hotels. And he said, "How about the Chateau Marmont?" And I said, "Is that good?" And he said, "Is it good?" He said, "Well, John Belushi died there." And I thought, oh, well, I guess that's good. He's definitely read the manuscript. This was actually all before Bright Lights Big City was published as a book. I'd managed to land an agent at ICM, which is a big international talent agency, and they had showed the manuscript around Hollywood, and it became kind of a hot commodity. So the first time I flew out for the first draft, big meeting, I got to the airport. Huge stretch limo waiting for me, from about here to the back of the room. Very elegant driver, tuxedo, spoke perfect English, and with an English accent. Whisked me off to the Chateau Marmont, and then I eventually went back home and waited, and I got a phone call, and I was told that it was great, it was brilliant, but the second act needed some work, and so I flew out again for another meeting. This time there was a sort of scruffy guy who didn't smell very good waiting for me at the airport with a much smaller car. It's kind of the story of the incredible shrinking limo. And then the process was repeated. I wrote a second draft, went home, and much later, about 6 weeks later, they called me again, and they had problems with the third act, and time to come out for another meeting. So when I got to the airport in Los Angeles, there's no one waiting for me. I called the studio, and they said, "Why don't you take a cab, and we'll reimburse you?" And that was kind of how the process went. I was subsequently dropped from the project. Didn't hear anything for quite a while, and then I heard that the movie was filming in New York City, and somehow a director named Joyce Chopra had been named director, and the producer was now Sidney Pollack. This really is a very typical Hollywood story. And then I heard that they watched the first 3 days of footage and were so horrified that they immediately, that is to say, Sidney Pollack and the United Artists team, they quickly did a search of which Hollywood directors were available to step in and take over this troubled shoot. And the man who came up on top was a guy named James Bridges, who did the China Syndrome and Urban Cowboy, yeah. And I mean, very good director. He did a lot of theater. He was a close friend of Tennessee Williams back in the day. So he took over suddenly within 3 days. They had fired Joyce Chopra, taken on Sidney Pollack, James Bridges. Bridges wrote all of the scripts that had been written to that day, and apparently there were 20 scripts that had been written up to that point. And he decided that the best script was my first draft, many, 2 years before. So that was what we shot.
Wow. Same thing happened with Gone with the Wind, you know. Selznick went through every draft and then came back to the original. And then when did the book come out? I mean,
well, the book came out in 1984. So my first trip, strange enough, I flew to Hollywood in August of '84 before the book came out. And it was a really big deal. I mean, I was a graduate student in creative writing, and I was living on a $4,000 fellowship and part-time work at a liquor store. And I had never flown first class. I'd never been to LA, and I mean, subsequently the book became a very big hit. But this was my first inkling that something big was going to happen, and it was very exciting. But also, and it was a little discouraging as the process dragged on. Movies. It's hard to get movies made, and this is not an atypical story. I mean, it sounds like, this sounds kind of disastrous the way I've told it, but as you say, like Gone with the Wind, and almost any movie you can think of probably has a similarly checkered road to the screen.
I bet everyone in this room has probably read the book, or if not seen the movie, right? I mean, that book just exploded. I mean, it captured the zeitgeist, of the '80s. The lifestyle, what young people were doing back then, and it was very autobiographical.
I used to say that the book wasn't autobiographical because I was afraid that people would think that I didn't have any imagination. But now that I'm more secure about it, yes, it was very autobiographical. Although David did just ask me the last scene where the protagonist Jamie is thrown out of the fashion show. He asked me if that was autobiographical, and in fact that scene was not. I was indeed married to a model who left me while I was working as a fact checker for the New Yorker. However, that scene strangely came true in a kind of an inverse way. A year after the book came out, it was published in Italy, and by the time I got to Italy, this book was a real kind of international phenomenon. And I was, my wife had left me for a fashion photographer in Italy. She went to the fall fashion shows and never returned from Milan. I went to the airport like 2 days running to wait for the flight from Milan, and she wasn't on either of those flights. And, this was back in the days when it was pretty hard to find people on a telephone. And but anyway, when I wrote this book that was partly based on her leaving me, and went to Milan, I was reading in this big theater, and it was a real mob. I mean, there were people it was beyond standing room, and in fact, shortly after I got up on stage to read, there was somebody phoned in a bomb threat, all these police pushing me one way, pushing the crowd another way, and suddenly my ex-wife, I saw her surging to the front, trying to get on stage to say hello to me and say, no, I'm his ex-wife, I'm his ex-wife. And it's very strange to me the way that scene was was reminiscent of this scene I had written about me trying to get on stage at the fashion show. So very satisfying too.
I would say so.
Revenge of the Nerd, I believe it's called.
Yeah, Jay, you were telling me that there's talk about remaking the film, you know, and I was looking at these clips, and a lot of it, you wouldn't even have to change. I mean, the talk about money, I think, has gotten even more intense. Certain things have changed, like, remember fashion shows where models were women and not 14-year-old skeletons. I miss that, you know. Yeah, talk about this, talk about it.
Well, again, we seem to be having many a slip between cup and lip. But starting about 4 years ago, a guy named Josh Schwartz, who was the creator of quite a few television shows, OC, Gossip Girl, Chuck, who's now moved into movies and written one or two of the X-Men movies, I guess. Anyway, he grew up with this ambition of wanting to make Bright Lights, Big City into a movie because he felt that this one wasn't a very good version. And I mean, I guess Josh must be about 37 now, so he's quite a bit younger than me. He's been working on this for many years, and he's now written a screenplay, and it's actually, well, it was contemporary when he wrote it, which is to say 2009, but he may have to update it again. And the only change he really felt that he had to make was that the protagonist now works at a website instead of a New Yorker, and he writes a blog. But otherwise, you know, young people still go to nightclubs. Drugs have disappeared from the scene. Fashion is just as important as it's more important, really. You know, when I came to New York, no heterosexual male would admit to knowing the name of a designer. Exactly. You know, like maybe Ralph Lauren, but I mean now, you know,
exactly.
Think of how the world has changed. And I will tell you one really strange thing I think is that the character Tad Allagash is the ultimate sort of cool friend. Jonah Hill wants to play that character, and so obviously it would be a very different type. You know, I'm willing to consider anything. I think one of the things that was wrong with the movie was partly that I wrote the screenplay closely mirroring the book, and one of the things that I think is I now know is that film and fiction are very, very different media, and one of the things that I like about that scene with Jason Robards taking Michael J. Fox to lunch is, you know, when I first saw the completed film, I think I went to a screening up on 42nd Street. It's that huge theater up on 42nd Street. What is it? Anyway, there was a very big audience. And so, and you know, it was a real, I mean, these were not intellectuals at the screening. I mean, it was like, you know, real people, regular people off the street. And I always thought that Bright Lights, Big City had an awful lot of very, very funny lines. And I would still maintain that that's true. And yet, all of the lines that I wrote, and all the lines that made it into the screenplay, the biggest laugh that I heard in that theater comes with just a jump cut. And what it is that Michael J. Fox, when he meets Jason Robards, he's way, 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 way behind on a deadline for an article. And he's vowed to himself that he's not gonna drink, he's not gonna, he's gonna really buckle down, he's gonna finish the article, he's gonna be a good boy, go to bed at reasonable hours now. And then that's when he walks in on Jason Robards at the water cooler, and everybody knows that, and if you watch the movie, you know that if he does not complete this article on time, then that's it, he's finished, he's fired, he's done. And he has good intentions, you know, he keeps saying, no more drinks for me. But the biggest laugh that I heard in the whole theater was that cut from, you know, this one scene where the restaurant's full and he's relatively sober, and you know the clock is ticking on his article, and then there's a cut, the restaurant's empty, there are all these empty glasses around him, and he's kind of weaving around. That was the big laugh. Now, the reason I find that interesting is because it made me realize that film is primarily a visual medium, and that you know, all the clever lines in the world do not make a movie. Images make movies, and so I think that I learned, you know, I learned a lot in this process. And I would have to say that, you know, I probably didn't write the world's best screenplay, but I'd love to try it again.
Do it, really, wonderful. Were you happy with Michael J. Fox as the lead? It was an
You know,
interesting casting choice, I always thought.
Michael J. Fox is very tricky as I think he's a great guy and a great actor, and I was happy. It was very weird. The first time I met him, sure, right before shooting started, I visited him in this apartment he was renting on Central Park West, and he opened the door, and we were wearing the exact same outfit. I mean, down to the shoes, and it was very eerie, and it kind of made it feel like this was right, you know. I mean, since the character is based on me. And we had a lot of fun during the shooting, and we became very close, and it seemed to me that he was doing an amazing job. On the other hand, Michael J. Fox came to that role with a lot of baggage, and basically he had just come off the biggest TV show of the 80s called Family Ties, which I'm sure many of you remember. And he plays this squeaky clean, young Republican kid with a briefcase. And another thing I learned from shooting Bright Lights Big City was the power of persona. In other words, it's all well and good for Michael J. Fox to want to break out of this persona, but that doesn't mean the audience is necessarily going to let him. And there were a lot of my fans who did not want to see Michael J. Fox play that part. Of course, Michael had way more fans than me, but you know, by the time that movie came out, you know, several million people had read the book, and very few people envisioned Michael J. Fox in that role. Now, it could have been a brilliant piece of sort of counterintuitive casting, right. And I must say, all through the shooting of the movie, I just felt he was great, and I thought it was cool that somebody as sympathetic as Michael J. Fox. I thought it might help us to, you know, get audience members who weren't necessarily living this kind of life to identify with the main character. I think in the end his image was a little too far away from that of the character we were trying to create from scratch on screen, and you know, he was so famous even at that time. This was his first movie, pretty much. And you know, I just remember walking out of, you know, we used to run around New York together, but